everyone. This is me and Sally again. We're back to continue our journey into building foundation services, all the CRUD operations in C Sharp, working all the way up to building APIs and then adding UIs on top of that. This is a little bit of a long journey, but we're having fun. I hope you're having fun, Sally. We're going to basically continue our journey here to basically, continue kind of fortifying the functionality that we build in here in a way that is, industrial, world class, enterprise level. The stuff that we build in here is the stuff that you can go and use into building any enterprise application around the world, regardless of what the business is. And it should basically, kind of, boost up your capabilities and your skill set to the moon. And so let's just jump here real quick. I'm gonna pull in the latest changes in here. And last time Sally was gonna go and do that. Yep, you did remove by ID, maybe book. You passed in the ID and you passed in the maybe book and you said, if this guy is failing, we should throw not found book exception, and then we have a corresponding, excuse me, corresponding test in here that matches this. Um, it matches this capability. So if I go out, this is how I test it. If I go here and comment this code, all of a sudden, what happens? Does something blow up? Something should blow up, right? We'll see. There you go. I should throw not found exception on remove by ID if book is not found. Wonderful. All right. So this is all good and dandy. Now let's jump into the next big thing, Sally. And the next big thing here is to basically be focused on every exception that's out there. Sometimes there are exceptions that are out of our control, right? Some exceptions are out of our control. For instance, let's say you are trying to communicate with this list, this broker that you're working with, and all of a sudden something happened in the system itself. It's not something that you caused. It's something that was out of your control,
Mhm.
right? Maybe maybe the server ran out of memory, right? Maybe
Mm.
there's a stack overflow. There is a, multiple dependencies in the service itself that is out of control. What should we do about this? This is where things get a little bit more interesting. There is something in programming called the catch-all or the service exception. And that service exception basically says, if anything happens that I haven't accounted for, catch any other errors that may happen in my system and do something with them. In our case here, we call them service exceptions. And I'm going to show you that in a second. Like, for instance, let's say, for instance, you have books itself coming in as null. For whatever reason, if this books here is null, for whatever reason, something went wrong in here. You will notice that most of your tests are blowing up. Look, most of them will, actually, that's, oh, we're mocking it. That's true. If I go and try to actually run the business because we're mocking this capability, but if you actually run it end to end, let's go here into our program and try to run this program in the real world. I'm gonna run it like this and let's see what happens. Oh, without null maybe, so it doesn't freak out. Let's do, excuse me, let's do it without the null. So let's go back here. Let's go add book, and this is new book. And I'm gonna add just a bunch of stuff in here just to test this capability. So I have ID, GUID, no GUID. I'll even do it this way. I'll go in here and say this is book. Like this, go and give me retrieve a book by ID, and I'm just gonna pass any ID in there. It doesn't matter. So
Mhm.
this is retrieve book by ID, and this is GUID.new GUID, like this, like this. Okay. Now what's gonna happen now? If I run this system like this, it's gonna blow up. It's gonna throw an exception. Look at this exception, and this exception basically says null reference exception. Why null? Because books are null, right? So we don't really know what's happening in the system here behind the scene. And there is something, there's a concept in programming that we call defensive programming. Defensive programming is to, just like defensive driving, to basically make sure that you are accounting for all the possible issues that could happen to your code from any direction. So think about your code as a castle, and you need to protect that castle by fortifying the castle and accounting for all the inputs and outputs, and making sure that if anything happens in your system, you are accounting for it and basically making sure that you can handle it. Does that make sense? So let's go back to the blackboard here. I'm going to show you a couple of interesting ideas. One second here. There we go. Let's go to the blackboard and let's just open something in here. I'll share my screen in a second. So let's say this is your service here. Your service, let's say this is some foundation, a service in general, something that contains business logic, no matter what it is. That's a service. And your service here has some dependencies. These dependencies may or may not produce issues that we are not accounting for. So here's an issue, something like a validation that happens when you're sending to an API, and the API says there is a validation issue. So I'm getting a validation error like this from the API, or I'm getting something like a dependency error. What does that mean? The database doesn't exist anymore. For instance, someone changed the credentials on the database and we can't access it anymore. Something like that. And there's the service exception. And the service exception that we're talking about here is basically an exception that happens that is really, it's a catch-all to all the possible issues that may occur, in your system in any way, shape, or form, right? So if this is a dependency and that's your integration, issues can occur all the time that we haven't accounted for. There's validation issues, there's dependency issues, and then there's service issues. There's only one type of exceptions that the service itself produce. What is that exception? Do you remember? The validation, right? This is the null exception, invalid exception, all of that. This is all validation. That makes this a dependency validation exception, and that makes this a validation exception. Okay, this is the high level picture. I just wanted to show you the high level kind of high map of what is happening. But now we want to account for a catch-all kind of exception. So I'm going to create a new file here. Let's start with the add. So see this new type of file. I'm basically saying dot exceptions dot add. So we have logic, we have validation, and we have exceptions. Okay. Now, what am I going to do in here? I'm going to go and say, check this out. I'm going to type this test in here and say, here's a fact, public void should throw service exception on add if service error occurs. You know what I'm saying? I'm basically going and saying, I want you to throw a service exception if any other exception occurs. How am I going to fake this exception to happen? I'll show you. So let's say that, excuse me, let's say the exception that's coming out is this guy here, service exception, new exception like this. All right. I want to make sure that when this exception happens, I am able to handle it and put a signature on it.
What does that mean?
What is the signature? The signature is to be able to go and say, I need a new type of exception in here. And this new type of exception called book service exception. So it's an exception that marks the service exception with the type of entity that it's working with. Are you with me?
Yeah.
So that basically means that I can go here and say, give me this inner exception, which is the original exception that was thrown. But go up in here and say, the message here says, book service error occurred, contact support. We don't know what happened. We need to talk to the engineers. because the end user that will be using your system doesn't know what to do with this. They don't really know what to do here. So that basically means that if I go to my validation, I'm gonna go and say this var, right? And this is expected book service exception, which will be a book service exception with this service exception as inner. See how I put a signature on it. I basically went in and I said, this guy here is this guy with a signature that says which entity it's coming from. Because if you let this exception propagate all the way up, it doesn't tell you where it's coming from. You're gonna have to look through something called stack trace, and it's just a waste of time. It's not good for the engineers. It's not productive. So I want to make sure that my service, when this exception happens, that it wraps it up in a book service exception. How do we fake this? We're gonna go here into our dependency, which is storage mock setup, and I'm gonna go and say this book insert book. It is any book because I don't care. I just want the exception to happen, right? When this happens, throw which one should it throw? Should it throw the service exception or the book service exception? Hmm.
Book service accept.
The service exception, because what the book service is going to do is that it's going to take this guy when it happens and wrap it up in a book service exception. Now let's try that. I'm going to go up in here and say action, add book action. Here it is. This dot service, add book, and we need a fake book. We need a fake book that can pass the validation. Let's do that. There you go. So this is some book. Why some book? Because we don't care really. It's just a filler so we can move on, but we know the exception is going to be thrown anyway. Now I can go here and say assert throws, right? What are we validating? Book service exception is coming out of this action. That's number one. And then number two is that I want to go and say this mock that I have should have been called, right? It is any book. Let me take that guy down by one. Should be called only one time. And then we validate, right, that there is no other calls have happened. Okay, why is this guy crying? Let's see.
Is to forgot the name of before the parenthesis open, so you put to
Oh,
those.
that's right. Thank you. Yep. So what is this test asking us to do? It's asking us that when this call happens, whatever book is being passed to it, a service exception is going to be thrown. And when this exception is thrown, it should be wrapped up in a book service exception. And that's what this service should be producing. So I'm going to go up in here and go and say, this guy is fail. That's a failing test. Okay, great. Now let's jump into the implementation side of it. I'm going to go here and say, try catch. Try catch basically me going and saying, try to run this logic, and if anything happens, let's check out the type of the issue that happened and let's handle it. That's try catch. So there's exception, exception. Now, what do you think I should do with this exception here? This guy here, what should I do with it? What do you think?
The root exception.
Row,
Mm,
service exception, maybe? This,
Right.
like this.
Oh yeah. The input me.
So I took that native exception and I mapped it into a book service exception. I took that existing exception here and I mapped it into a book service exception. Why did we need to do this? Because I need to add in the signature This service has handled this exception and put its mark on it,
Mm.
whatever that exception may be. Okay, do you think that do you think that would make our test pass?
Yes.
Let's give it a shot. Let's see. Ah, look at that. We're
Mhm.
having trouble in here. Why are we having all this trouble in here? Let's see why is that.
Mhm.
The reason why the reason why we're having this trouble here is because
Okay.
this null book exception is one of the children of exception.
Mm.
So now everything is throwing book service exception.
Mhm.
Let me try to explain this again. The original test that we wrote here has passed, right?
Right.
These two tests in here are failing because we expected a null book exception to come out of this work, but
Mm.
because we're handling all the exceptions that are coming out,
Mm.
it's
Mm.
catching it as a catch-all.
Right.
Now, your assignment is to
Mm.
let these two pass.
Mm.
I'll give you a hint. Give you a hint. This catch can happen in multiple places. We can have multiple catches
Mm.
for different
Mm.
types of exceptions.
Mhm.
Different types of exceptions.
Mhm.
What can we do with this piece of information
Mhm.
that can help us basically distinguish the catch-all from
Mhm.
other types of exceptions that we want to allow to propagate through the system?
Basically, switch in case if there are the other cases, we can like get out of the catch.
I don't know. Give it a try. That's
Mm.
basically. So I'm gonna
Yeah.
put this in here and I'm gonna go and say this guy here,
Mhm. Good.
the original guy that we wanted to pass has
Mm.
passed. But we have a problem in our code now. The problem is that we have two failing tests. And the problem with these two tests is that this catch all is blocking them.
Notebook
It's
exception.
catching them. Yeah. So null book exception and invalid book exception too, because both of them are children of,
Mm-hmm.
so this is null, this is invalid. They're both, if you look inside the definition of them, they are children of exception, which inherits from exception. They're all children of the same parent, the
Mm-hmm.
same parent class. The trick here, Sally, is to learn about how to handle different types of exceptions before resolving to the catch-all. This guy is the catch-all.
I see.
All right. Do you
Uh,
have any questions?
no.
That's all I want you to do. Just think
Okay.
about how can I make these two tests pass? And
Right.
once you figure that one out, we'll continue with the rest of the.
Excellent. Something you mentioned last session about wrapping. So basically, the concept you introduced was all wrapping because you said we will talk about wrapping next session. Still
Mm,
haven't got there, yeah?
this is the introduction to wrapping.
Okay.
What we did here, look at this. This action here is called wrapping. I wrapped up this exception by this exception.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But okay, but that's a catch-all. What are we gonna do about the other two?
Got it. Mm.
Just by one piece of advice, just really think really deep and hard. The piece of information that I can give you is that you can handle any type of exception before you catch all.
Mm.
You can add any other type before you determine that you want to catch all.
Okay.
I'll even normalize it for you. I'm gonna simplify it a little bit and say, you go and say, catch X exception and then do something, right?
Mm.
So in here, do something, right? And then there's another one, catch
Yeah.
Y exception, and then do something. And then if it's not X and it's not Y, then catch all, which
Mm-hmm.
is the exception,
Mm-hmm.
and then do something.
Okay.
Think about that, and let's connect tomorrow, and we'll
Perfect.
see how far we're gonna go. All right.
Thank you. It was
Thank you so much, Sally.
good
All
night.
right.
Bye.
You take care. Bye.